Occasionally, we have an opportunity to spotlight our clients, and we're going to do that here in the next segment. With the successful landing of Perseverance on Mars this past week, it was just a phenomenal accomplishment. We wanted to highlight one of the most innovative firms in space and also a client for a number of years, VOX Space. We welcome Gilbert Tseng from VOX Space. Gilbert's the Director of Business Development and Strategy at VOX, bringing rapid and responsive space access to our national security space community through the Launcher One system. Prior to VOX, Gilbert spent 15 years with Northrop Grumman. So we welcome Gilbert. Can we find Gilbert on the tiles?
I am here. Hello.
Hello.
And
fantastic.
thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to brief. Definitely appreciate SMA Wins and all you guys do for us. You have an outstanding team, so always appreciate the support. So yes, as you mentioned, I am Gilbert Tseng. I'm the Director of Business Development and Strategy here at VOX Space. And I think I have a few slides. I don't know if somebody's got the slides available to put up.
They'll be popping up momentarily. Great. Great to have you on, Gilbert.
There we go. Again, Director of Business Development. VOX Space is a new startup launch company. I should say new is a relative term. We were founded in 2017 with the purpose of bringing the Launcher One system to our national security space customers. The Launcher One system is a ground-up designed small launch system trying to democratize space access for everybody from commercial to national security space. This is a picture just as a kind of a fun intro. This is a picture from our most recent launch activity. For any of you airplane geeks out there, if you can identify the chase plane that this picture was taken from. So this was taken from a chase plane. And you can see in the background here, the big plume going off to the left is actually our rocket as it's proceeding on its first stage burn. And then the contrails to the right are actually our carrier aircraft banking away from the rocket as it's after its release. If we go to the next slide, please. So the fun part about VOX Space and Virgin Orbit is our parent company who designs the Launcher One system. The Virgin Orbit Launcher One system is actually an air launch system. So unlike most of our colleagues in the launch business, who primarily launch from ground-based systems at places that everyone knows, like Vandenberg Air Force Base or Cape Canaveral Air Force Base or Kennedy Space Center. We are an air launch system. So we designed a rocket kind of out of the heritage of Virgin Galactic. We developed an engine system and a rocket that said, hey, this would be really good for satellite launch. And we took that and spun this off into Virgin Orbit. And this rocket system is air-mounted or air-carried via a carrier aircraft. In our case, the carrier aircraft is a 747. This aircraft heritage is actually formerly a Virgin Atlantic aircraft that we purchased from Virgin Atlantic. And for fun fact, it's called Cosmic Girl, and it was actually named Cosmic Girl from Virgin Atlantic. So we transferred over a passenger aircraft, we stripped out the aircraft, and then we built a pylon, or what we call the pylon, which is the carrier aircraft is what we call ultimately our fully reusable first stage. And we use that to carry the rocket up to about 35,000 feet. The rocket there drops from the aircraft at about Mach 0.85. And then 5 seconds later, the engine ignites and it goes off into space. Because this is a carrier mobile system, we have actually an entirely mobile launch system and platform. So all the ground support equipment you see in the foreground is actually all trailerized. Soon it will be all palletized and be able to carry within a freight 747 aircraft. So we can actually transport this anywhere in the world with no infrastructure on the ground other than being able to provide liquid oxygen and rocket fuel, or essentially kerosene. So it allows us to be able to launch from anywhere in the world, any runway in the world that's able to support 747 operations. So it really opens up how you access space, especially for countries that potentially don't have normal space access. So right now we are operating out of Mojave Air and Spaceport in Mojave, California. We are also launching very soon from Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. But we're also looking at places like Oita, Japan, Cornwall, England. There's been discussions for other places, including Italy, also launching from Florida, the UAE, or somewhere in the Mideast. So there's a lot of options for how we actually can bring launch to countries that don't normally have space access. Next slide, please. A quick bingo card or a baseball card of our Launcher One vehicle. We are a dedicated small launch company. So we service what we call small satellites. Small satellites typically are under, the number varies, but our payload capacity is typically 300 to 500 kilograms, as opposed to some of those big SpaceX Falcon 9 launches that you see, which are multiple tons, 8,000 to 12,000 pound or kilogram satellites. We're on the much smaller end of that. And because of the democratization of electronics and the ability to compress a lot of these capabilities into smaller and smaller packages, the world has actually seen a big transition from going from really, really big satellites, and there's always going to be a need for those really, really big satellites. But you get a lot of capability out of small satellites now, and that's what we're actually trying to bring to the community, is the ability to launch small satellites at a fraction of the price tag that we used to need for big, big satellites. So the Launcher One rocket in and of itself is 70 feet long. It's about 57,000 pounds fully loaded. That includes the satellite and all the fuel. When it's flying at its first stage, its typical launch speed is about 8,000 miles per hour. Once we get into orbit, it's about 17,000 miles per hour. And it's a two-stage rocket. So aside from, as we joke about the first stage being the carrier aircraft, the first stage of the rocket itself is powered by what we call the Newton 3 engine. So that's our primary engine. It is 73,000 pounds. And then we have a second engine called the Newton 4 engine. That's our second stage. It's capable of with about 5,000 pounds of thrust on average. Run times you see about 3 minutes and 6 minutes each respectively. As I mentioned before, 300 to 500 kilograms of payload to low Earth orbit, and that's where our primary market is, low Earth orbit. It's typically somewhere between 200 kilometers to about 1,000 kilometers in altitude. Next slide, please. So as a small launch company, I think you'll see there's a lot of competition out there. There's a lot of people investing in small launch and trying to bring small launch capabilities to the marketplace. We'll say we are the second or arguably the third successful launch. And so on January 2021, so earlier this year, we had our first successful launch. It was a super exciting Saturday for us where we actually dropped the rocket. This is a picture from the chase plane again, where the rocket had just pulled off from the aircraft of Cosmic Girl. The engine and it started to go out into orbit. If we go to the next slide. So this mission was called the Alana 20 mission. It was sponsored by NASA as part of what they call the VCLS program, Venture Class Launch Services. So NASA likes to take bets on satellite vendors who haven't quite proven themselves yet, but they say we're okay with accepting some risk, and so we'll try out whether or not we can help them get to orbit. So NASA was actually our second launch, or what we call Launch Demo 2. But it was our successful launch. So we did Launch Demo 1 in the May timeframe of last year, 2020. It didn't quite go as well as we wanted it to, but then we did a significant amount of failure review, analysis on the rocket and its performance, and trying to understand what the heck happened. And then we transitioned over and did a lot of corrections. And NASA was confident enough in that, in our fixes and our review, that they said, yeah, we'll go ahead and launch with you on the second launch. And as a result, we had a very successful launch. We had 10 satellites on board. This picture is actually as we were doing what we call our second stage coast. So the engine had stopped burning, and we took a picture. We had video and telemetry the entire time. All 10 satellites were successfully released off orbit. They were placed exactly where we wanted it to. If you look at our simulation plots and our kind of analysis as we went forward and said, hey, how do we actually project how well we're going to do, or where do we want to be? And then we plotted that against our performance. We were right down the middle. So it provided a huge amount of confidence in all our systems and processes and understanding how we wanted to go. I do see a comment on here about how can you do ground control from the 747 or just transport the gear to a ground site. So we actually can do ground control remotely from anywhere. It's all radio comms and sat comms for the aircraft itself. And then telemetry is actually monitored through somewhat traditional telemetry systems. And we have our own network of telemetry systems that we can do that. So ground control can actually happen from anywhere. Primarily, mission control primarily in Mojave, but we actually had for this last launch, because of COVID restrictions, quite a few of the mission controllers in Long Beach, California, which is where the rocket factory is. And the question, which parts are not made in the U.S. And is somebody % made in the U.S.? There's a few little nitnoid pieces. One example of that is some of the fasteners aren't quite made in the U.S. And I believe, actually, I know that the GPS unit, strangely enough, is not built in the U.S. because there are strangely some U.S. restrictions on GPS that preclude rocket manufacturers from buying GPS unless you're under a DoD contract. And while we have DoD contracts, we design our rocket and launch our rocket all under commercial auspices. So everything's under an FAA launch license as opposed to a traditional military launch control. So we don't actually require any, but because of that, we have to buy our GPS from outside the U.S. Okay.
Fantastic, Gilbert.
Super successful launch.
Do you have more slides, Gilbert?
And one more. Actually, two more, I should say. Super successful launch. This is a fun little picture as well. So this is actually from Cosmic Girl, overlooking the launch and the rocket from San Nicolas Island. So that's what you can see. This is all, the launch took place off the coast of Los Angeles. Nicolas Island is part of the Channel Islands chain. We just like this picture because it's kind of fun. I think the last that, the question, and one of the questions that came in when we were asked to speak is where do we see launch going? And one of the things that we really advocate for is what we call responsive and rapid launch. And so the real thing that we actually developed, so when you look at the Launcher One system and what we needed to be able to accomplish with Launcher One, one of the differentiators for us is that we are not tied to fixed infrastructure. We saw this actually last year where Cape Canaveral actually got stacked up with rockets to the point that there was risk to other rockets if a rocket failed. And if the infrastructure actually had problems, they actually had scheduling issues and they had problems getting everybody in there. Because we're not tied to a fixed infrastructure, we can launch from just about anywhere. We are actually able to avoid some, hey, this fixed infrastructure may have risk. So if something happened to Cape Canaveral, like a hurricane, or if malicious things happen to a launch site like Vandenberg, we aren't tied to that. We're able to launch from anywhere. The other thing that actually allows us to do is from a responsive launch perspective, and when I say responsive, we're able to launch very quickly and flexibly to allow us to get to space and where we need to be in space whenever we need to be there. So one of the interesting challenges are from a space-time perspective, if you think, I need to be somewhere in space at a very specific time. So I need to launch and be able to reach a very specific point in space and time. I'm tied to two geographic locations, Cape Canaveral and Vandenberg. If I launch, I have to sit there. I launch at the best time that I can launch from, and then I have to drift my way to the I need to be at. And so you can kind of unwind the dynamics of that. By being able to move our launch location, it actually gives us the ability to better optimize our launch schedule and how we actually reach the space we need to be at, so we can potentially get there quicker. So this gives us an interesting advantage in terms of national security launch in space and the ability to meet specific and very pinpointed and accurate space requirements more quickly than a traditional ground-based launch. So this is actually what we're really trying to focus on, give an overview or a capability of the national security world that we haven't been able to do before. At the same time, bring cheaper, more cost-effective space access to the rest of the world as well. Small launches providing access to space that nobody's done before. Do things in space just because it costs too much money. And now we have that ability to actually do these things at a fraction of the cost of what we used to be doing before. So what used to be $1 billion program is now a $100 million program. What used to be $100 million is now about, so we can do some really interesting things now in space that we wouldn't have been able to conceive of 10 years ago. So yeah, that briefing here, definitely appreciate it. I think there was a couple other questions, additional questions, or you feel free to reach out to me. And I'm sure my contact info is floating around somewhere. So definitely happy to talk more about that. I think, do we have time to answer some of these questions, or do you need to push on?
So let's take one question. First of all, wow, huge applause to VOX. I think what we're seeing here is going to be a revolution in affordable access to space. Not if others here who aren't familiar with the launch vehicle industry and kind of what the Gordian knot issue has been essentially affordable access to space around launch vehicles. And for smaller satellite manufacturers, you'd have to wait for a ride as an auxiliary payload on the larger launches, right? And now it's just amazing in terms of what companies like VOX have been able to achieve. It's fantastic. Let's see. Let's take one question, Gilbert, if there's one here.
There's a couple. Let's see here. Top question that I saw asked, what's the max we can launch to? And so there's a couple different ways to parse that. The rocket's designed to launch at 35,000 feet. Of course, we can actually, or drop from 35,000 feet from the aircraft. We can actually bring that up even higher, but 35,000 feet was kind of the optimal point of essentially density in the air that we actually launch from. So we have controllability of the rocket from the air density perspective. If we're talking about orbitology and how high can we go from perspective, how much mass we need to carry to orbit. So if it's a big heavy satellite, so on the 500 kilogram side, it's definitely lower. There's also a function of inclination. So if we are launching to what we call a polar orbit, or something that kind of goes over the poles, as opposed to a low inclination orbit, which primarily focuses its circular orbit around the equator area. If it's around the equator, we get a lot of advantages from a physics perspective, so we can carry more mass because of the Earth rotation, whereas polar orbits tend to be less mass. So our design reference mission, and what we call our kind of standard reference point, is 300 kilograms to 500 kilometers in altitude at sun-synchronous orbit, which is a 98-degree orbit.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of this with us, Gilbert. There's a ton of fascinating questions I think we all have for you. So we'd love to welcome you back at some point again. So thank you, Gilbert. That was just totally fascinating. And congratulations to yourself and VOX and all of your colleagues here.